to Rabbi Daniel, and you can take it away.
Oh, right. Thank you, Mara. Just thank you for your kind words. And Mara is also one of my favorite people to learn from and to talk to and to learn with. So it's a real pleasure to be here. But just one correction, although I identify and practice modern Orthodox Judaism, my role as an educator and teacher and leader has always been in a non-denominational forum. And so I don't feel like I'm teaching as a representative of the modern Orthodox. I think I'm just teaching Torah, but I'll let you judge for yourselves. And so we're picking up this week in Parashat Va'era, which is number 2, second Parsha in the book of Exodus. And we left with sort of like a cliffhanger. God said to Moses last week, go back and try to free my people. And he went, and things just got worse. And so Moses was talking to God and was like, what the hell? You know, like I go there and we're supposed to free the people. And now they got to make more bricks and life's harder for them. And so we begin with God's response this week, which is a sort of a morale booster for Moses, and a reminder that even though the people won't have the morale boosted right away, which we'll see, it is a model for, I think, morale boosting in general, because we'll see there is an idea that what happened at the Exodus from Egypt will also happen at the ultimate liberation of when Messiah comes, that there's a parallel there. And last, that we'll see there are opinions who also look at this as a Torah for personal salvation or personal liberation, and as a guide. So that's my intro. Hopefully I remembered everything I wanted to say. Mara, are you going to share the screen? We'll look at the first few verses in the Parsha.
So I just added the link to the chat as well, so you're welcome to bring it up on your own screen. But here we are. I'm going to scroll down to English.
All right, so I'll read. And I have my own little version here, so I'm not worried about your scrolling. All right, so I'll read the Hebrew and English. Vayidaber Elokim el Moshe. The Lord said to Moses, Vayomer elav ani Hashem. And he says, I am the Lord. Vayira el Avraham el Yitzchak el Yaakov be'el Shaddai. And it was I who appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as with my name Shaddai, Ushmi Hashem, and the name of this spelling of God's name. We're not going to spend time on this, but it's an interest. You could do a whole class on this. This name of God was not known to them. V'gam hakimoti et briti item latet lahem et eretz Canaan et eretz migureim asher garuba. And he continues and says, I also have established a covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they will live there. And Gamani Shamati in Kapane Israel. And I've also heard the cries of the children of Israel, Asher Mitzrayim Ma'avdimotam, that the Egyptians are enslaving them, the escort briti, and I remember my covenant, right? So just between the lines, you could say, maybe what Moses was saying was, God, you made a promise to these guys that this wouldn't happen, that we're not going to be stuck like this forever. Right, so God's saying, I know that I made that promise, and I hear what's going on right now. And therefore, and more Lebanei Yisrael, say to the Jews, Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. And I will take you out from under the burdens of Egypt. And I will save you from their slavery. And I will liberate you with an outstretched arm, with great wonders. And I will take you for me to be a nation, and I'll be for you a God. And you'll really know that it is I, the Lord your God, who've taken you out from under the burdens of Egypt. And I will take you to the land asher nasati et yadi, that I lifted up my hand, to give it Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will give that to you as an inheritance, because I am the Lord. And so this is God saying to Moses, don't worry, I know you're worried. I know things look bad, but I got it covered, and everything's going to be okay. And the last verse, which I didn't put in the source sheet, is Vayidaber Moshe Kein Bnei Israel, and Moses, transmitted this all to the Jews. V'lo shamu al Moshe, but they couldn't hear him. Mikotzer ruach u'mevad oda kasha, because of their weak spirits from all their hard work. But this is understood by most of our sages to be the model of redemption and the process of redemption that's elaborated by many commentaries on the 4 words that come up in verse 7, and the last one starts in verse 8. And those are the words that I'll just say them out loud, and then I'll go back to my screen so I can see you. Behotseti, I will take you out. V'hitzalti, I will save you. V'ga'alti, I will liberate you. V'lakachti, and I will take you. And those 4 terms are the terms, are what we say are, actually, Mara, can we scroll down to the next source? Are the 4 terms that correspond to why we drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Let me just read this one source, and then I will take Susie's hand that I see up. So the Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud is what we call the Jerusalem Talmud in Hebrew. Minayin la'arba kosot. So how do we know we drink 4 cups at the Seder? Rabbi Yochanan b'shem Rabbi Benaya. Rabbi Yochanan says the name of Rabbi Benaya, Kineged arba geulos. We drink 4 cups because of the 4 verses of redemption. He quotes it. This is what you should say to the Jews. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. I'll take you out. And I'll take you. Right? So it's those 4 phrases. And that corresponds to this experience of liberation that we celebrate at the Seder. It's not just today. This is a really foundational text and idea here in Judaism. I'll stop for 2 questions. Susie and then Noah.
Thank you. I have a very difficult question, and I apologize for it. I hear everything that is being said here, and I'm following it, and I believe it in my heart. What's not here, but we say in the Shema every day, is there's the first part, but then there's our part. And it seems to me that almost every Jew on the planet right now is practicing their own version of Judaism. But God was very clear in the Torah of what the mitzvot are and what our obligations are. Is that why we haven't been redeemed yet? Is it because we're not holding up our end of the covenant? I mean, I know many, many, many Jews are. But
it's a really long question. You said it's a difficult question. I will give you a quick answer, but knowing it's not giving you enough credit, and we'll keep touching upon it, I think, as we continue the conversation. But my quick answer is there's very little evidence that the Jews in the time of Egypt had deserved it. In fact, there's evidence that say that they didn't deserve it at all, and that's why God needed to save them right there. And so that, I think, your question, and there's so much in Judaism that would inform your question, and yet there's also this alternative approach leads to a misunderstanding, I think, what the future exile will look like. Will it happen because we're so good that we deserve it, or will it happen because it's so hopeless that we need it? And it's all, and at the end of the day, none of us knows, and I really don't have a good answer, because I think the message that comes through our tradition is, God knows, we don't, and there is no way for us to know. And I think there will be more conversation topics as we continue that may be interesting to your question, although not directly answering it. So let's see, and we'll see at the end if there's time to follow up. Noah and then Janet. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Rabbi. I wanted to say something about almost all the exiles we've been in. If we notice, do you believe that God uses us as a tool to punish other nations? Because if we look at it, almost every single nation that has ever done harm to us is now essentially off the face of the earth. The Egyptians are essentially no longer around.
Well, I always say to everybody who wants to be an anti-Semite, I'm like just saying, just look at world history. The anti-Semites are always remembered as the jerks of world history, and they never actually are successful. And so you wake up with the same idea as all these other jerks of history. It's the Jews. We got to get them. You might want to rethink that. It has yet to work out for anybody. That's just my thoughts based on what you said so far.
Yeah, and if we look at the Persians as well, they no longer really exist. Germany, they've never had any economy ever since World War II. So I believe that God essentially uses us as a tool to help punish other nations and also to teach us a lesson at the same time. Perhaps. So he essentially does 2 birds with 1 stone.
Could be. So, we'll see if we continue. Janet, last question, and we'll go on from here.
Okay, I put this in the chat, but I don't know if you can see it. Adonai made a promise or a covenant with the people, but he did not make himself known to them. So who did they think this covenant was coming from if they didn't know God and God didn't let himself be known to them? And the other part of my question, which someone else picked up on also, there were 4 cups in the Seder because of the 4, I put in here phrases, but the 4 forms of redemption. And there were also 4 children, and someone answered that there are also 4 questions, like 4 keeps happening.
You'll have to have me back for a Seder class, and then we can talk about all the symbolism in the Seder. And it's there.
Okay.
You're 100% right, but it's off topic.
Okay,
And as is your first question, but I'll address it
first
so it's not a distraction.
Yeah.
Because it really can be a topic for itself. There, you know, the spelling of the name of God with the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, which we saw right before and said, and this name was not known to them, is actually found in the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's a classic question of how in the world could God tell Moses that they didn't know this name when all you have to do is look in the Torah, and they did know this. You know, God spoke using this name in the Torah. So it's a famous question. You could probably Google it, find lots of answers. But real quickly, I think what's the most easily to, you know, on one foot, just explain it real fast and move on, is it's less about like, what's your name? What name tag do you wear? And it's more about the way in which God is manifested in the world. And until the liberation from Egypt happened, that was a aspect of the way in which God works in the world that nobody had seen or understood just yet. That the nature of the world will change from this point forward is an easy way to explain that. Okay, Marek, you scroll down a little bit. All right, so let's look at, I have to decide whether we want Ramban, and we're done. What, 10:15 is the end time there?
Yeah.
All right, so, you know, let's scroll down past these two, past the Ramban and past Sforno, and we'll go past the Middle Ages into more of the modern, and we'll start there, or Chaim. Okay, so I want to look a little bit into God is all powerful and God is perfect, and God could have been like, boom, free from Egypt, all in one, you know, fell swoop. There doesn't seem to be a necessity from the perspective of human beings to say that God needed to have a gradual process, that why couldn't God have just been like, 0 plagues, you're free, miraculous, you know, there's all sorts of miraculous things happening. Why do we have to have it in 10 plagues and splitting the sea? Why not just in one fell swoop is I think a question that gets asked internally, even if it's not explicit, by so many of our commentators. And the assumption is God doesn't do anything by accident. Everything is part of a plan, and that the different stages are necessary. And the reason they're necessary will depend on, you know, the commentator. And so we'll look at just a few approaches, or maybe just one approach, depending on timing. But that's sort of the idea. Is why are we talking about 4 stages, 4 words, when God could have done it in 1? And so what's the lesson? What do we get from that? And so let's look here at Or HaChaim. The reason we're using him instead of the Ramban, Sforno, or many others from earlier is because I think he has a different approach afterwards, but he sort of sums up without being explicit about it, but he's covering a lot of what the bases are about how to understand these 4 words. So let's look in the English. It's easier and faster. So, therefore, tell the Jews that I am the Lord. And this is about a response. Everybody's complaining. Moses, we didn't need you. Our life was better before you came. Moses saying to God, what the heck? You know, why did you send me if we're just going to make the people's lives harder? And now God's saying this is the message to send back to the people. Okay. So Moses was to tell the Israelites in the name of God that he was the attribute of mercy, and that he had decided to invoke this attribute on their behalf. Back to what we were saying earlier, who knows if they deserved it, but this is God's decision to save them now, because God's merciful. And as a result of that mercy, he's going to lead them out of Egypt, perform the other stages, which would complete the process of redemption. The word lachein is a form of an oath. We know from Ezekiel 20, I'm going to skip through this a little fast. In that instance, the prophet refers to our verse as something concerning which God had said, I have raised my hand, as a clear form of an oath. So it's saying, God's saying, don't worry, Moses, I promised. I'm just summarizing here a little bit what he said. I do talk fast. I'm sorry. I'm trying to quickly through till we get to the good stuff. If I'm going really fast, it means I'm just trying to get to the good stuff generally. If I'm going just kind of fast, it means I'm excited. So God enumerates the steps of redemption. So here we go. This is the part I really wanted to focus on. Number 1, first, I will take you out from beneath the hard labor of Egypt. Okay, so that's the first thing that has to happen. is there's a gradual process, and you can't just be free people overnight. So number one, it's I'm going to take you out from the hard labor. It's the removal of slave labor performed by the Egyptians, or for the Egyptians, not by the Egyptians. And it would commence immediately with the plague of blood. You know, if we had hours and hours, lots of midrash and lots of other commentators who go into why at the stage of blood, maybe it was a different part. You know, all different commentators have different opinions on when the process started. But Or Chaim is saying with the stage of blood, because it resulted in the dispersal of although it resulted in the dispersal of the taskmasters, the Israelites continued to perform light duty tasks. And so I don't know if this is going to be, relatable to the rest of you, but when I was reading this year, the first time thinking about it, and I'm thinking about, like March, what was it, 8th, 2020, or 2013, I forget the exact date that like the lockdown started. And when chaos happens around the world, people tend to like stay at home and get worried about what the future is going to be, and society breaks down a little bit. So you can imagine if all the water in society turned to blood, and there are magical things happening all over, and everybody's sort of confused what's going to happen, and there's a fear about what's society and how are people going to react to that. A lot of people probably didn't go to work. So one possible thing that I'm noticing here is that the chaos that began to ensue with the beginning of the plagues led to the lack of the same organization that was going on in society, which led to a breakdown in some of those power dynamics and roles and stratification in Egyptian society, to the degree that the taskmasters were no longer there. So what do the Jews do? They've been living in fear of these taskmasters. And so according to Or Chaim and others, they're saying there was no longer forced slavery from the time of blood on, and I'm reading into it, just my relationship of when the world goes crazy. So that must have happened similarly in Egypt. But Jews kept going to work. They kept doing work out of a fear of Egyptians and out of a habituation towards slavery. And so that's not really what we're talking about. Jack, you have a question?
No, I wanted to mention one thing, that we all know that why did God have us go to Egypt in the first place? In thinking about it, we were supposed to become a nation of priests, which is an intermediary between spreading God's word. And to know that, you have to understand the people that you're preaching to. We, as from Abraham on, we were basically an elite group. Even when we went down to Egypt, when Joseph was there, due to the burials, Joseph and Jacob were buried as Egyptian nobility. By having us, once there was a change in the Pharaoh, we then became slaves. At that time, we became slaves. And I believe that had to do with the fact that to understand who you were going to preach to, you had to know who they were and live by them. And this was the reason why the Exodus, we look at Exodus as us being freed, but the Exodus really has to do with the second part, that God had to prove himself to other people that he was the God. The universal aspect of Genesis 1 through 11, I believe is to explain things not only to me and to us now, because from then on, the story had to do with the Jews becoming a nation of priests.
Yes, actually. So I think there's messages here, universal messages, there's national messages, and there are personal messages. So we will get to at least some of those. And so number one is that there was a gradual process. And so one thing I'm skipping, by the way, is that the process into slavery this is the reverse process out, according to many. They look at it either as what God promised Abraham in the covenant between the parts about what's going to happen to his people, and we'll look at that as a 4 stages descent. Some will look at that. Others will look at the description of Pharaoh, what they did to the Jews, as a 4-stage descent. And so the ascent, the liberation, mirrors those 4 stages, according to many. And so that's because it's suiting that if this is the way that they were inflicted slavery upon them, then there has to be a reverse mirroring process to remove it. So so number one is that there's, the process started with blood, and then you can think psychologically, because now there's something happening. Even if they hadn't been freed yet, their oppressors are being punished, and the degree of the forced labor is being diminished. So it's a process that began when the chaos ensued of the plague of blood. Moses saying God's going to come, and now we're starting. Even though they weren't fully redeemed, there's already a psychological experience of redemption. And so we drink a cup of wine. You have to celebrate at the Seder, because even just knowing that maybe I could be freed, maybe there's hope. If you're a Star Wars fan, and one of those movies before episode 4, they said, hope is what rebellions are built on, right? Without hope, why do you even bother standing up? But hope is where it starts. So the beginning of the process started an experience of hope, a psychological experience of hope, and even that is enough to raise a glass to in terms of the process of liberation. So next comes, I will save you from their bondage. And that's okay. So you were freed. You're not doing, the taskmasters aren't upon you, but they're still working, right? So the Or Chaim and others are saying, that's saying, but now Jews are like, well, we don't even have to work anymore. Like we're really no longer slaves, but they're still in Egypt, right? So number 2 is that they really stopped working. Number 3 is I will liberate you. Right? He says this refers to the actual departures of the Israelites from the country. So now they're not slaves. Now they're released slaves, or they are escaped slaves, right? And so they're on their way out. And it includes the splitting of the sea, because had the sea not split, the whole thing would have been a waste. What bothers there? If you can't get out, then you're not really free. The word ga'alti, which is the word we're referring to in Hebrew, must refer to a liberation which is not followed by pursuit, right? Slaves on the run are not the same as slaves not on the run, right? Slaves on the run are still slaves. Slaves not on the run are not slaves. They're free people, is what he's saying. Right? So following that stage, so once they're gone, they could be free. There's a famous song, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. It's not really the Jewish idea of freedom, of free to do nothing. Or it's that you're now, I will take you to be for me a nation, is the last thing God says. You're not free to just be free. You're not free to just leave Egypt. You're free so that I can take you to be my people, right? So that's the 4th stage that the Jewish people were able to experience of the redemption at this point. Can you scroll down a little? I'm going to skip. Keep going. Oh yeah, let's skip that. I'm gonna skip to Kli Yakar also. So let me what comes next on my source sheet? Yeah, all right, let's can you scroll up so we don't see what it says on the source sheet here? Let's just talk a little bit. Okay. Yeah, Chris Christopherson wrote it, made famous by Janis Joplin. And so what we're seeing here is a description of the text, saying, here's a story. The people were upset. They had, were already oppressed and slaves, and, life was not great. And now Moses came and made it worse. And Moses says to God, why'd you do that? And God says, don't worry, it's all part of the process, right? The process is liberation doesn't happen overnight, right? God, I could have done it, but think about your lives as human beings. You're not going to just wake up one night and flip a switch and now you're a better person. Right. And think about national liberation. We don't just wake up one night and all of a sudden magic happened and everything's changed and the world's a better place. And right, these things, just like slavery doesn't happen over time. We got a much clearer sense when you study, Germany in the 30s. There was a gradual dehumanization before they were able to carry out the worst atrocities. Right. Similarly happened in Egypt. And so in order to overcome that, there has to be a reverse process that has to be gradual, he's saying. And so that gradual process is a lesson of understanding the history, but really, why do we care so much? Why, like, I've only given you a drop in the bucket of commentary on these topics, is because it's a symbol, as I mentioned in the beginning, for a future liberation as well, for the redeeming of the world, and also for personal salvation, or for personal growth at the very least, right? And so the process he's saying is it has to start with just the removal of oppression is number 1. Right. First, it was the taskmasters were gone. And then it was the next stage too, was that then they started feeling free and they stopped doing work. Right. They still worked even when the taskmasters were gone in stage 1. Stage 2, we're saying, well, we're kind of free. Stage 3 is like, well, we're actually free. And then stage 4 is free to do something with ourselves. Right. We're not just surviving. We're not just, doing okay. We are going to be thriving someday. And this is the process to get there. So before I finish it up, I've got a few questions here. Let's take the hands. Brian, Heidi, and Noah will be the order. And then Mara, if there are any highlights from the chat, I'll call on you unless some other hands pop up.
Can I speak?
Yeah, Brian, your turn.
Yes, no, it's just a commentary and to bring several things forward in terms of why the 4 stages. This is just something for me to throw out there, and it's the importance always within the faith of tradition and like when you opened up and you gave your introduction in terms of identifying, how you're labeled or what, in terms of the current Jewish faith. And from my way of looking at it, in terms of God, in terms of the redemption of what happened in Exodus, is that always the group that is always holds with tradition and holds true to the faith, going all the way back to Abraham, and then coming in, that's God hears them. And what unfortunately happens is a lot of times when we're in amongst other peoples, we have a tendency sometimes become secularized, and then over the course of generations, the younger generations fall away, and it gradually happens to the point at which almost everyone forgets God. It's like it's there amongst the elders, and that's why, like when the gentleman spoke earlier, why he thought it was priestly, because that was the transition. It's just like God, yes, he could snap his hands, but the fact is that all the people that have fallen away, who have become secularized, need to be brought back in, and it's through the tradition. It's God speaking to those who he identifies as the most strong, whether it is in spirit and in faith, will be able to gradually, as they see, okay, step one is taking place. Now more people are opening up and they're coming back to where they were lost. And then finally, when he opens up the seas and they're able to get that liberation, the important thing is, well, you need the priestly class. Why? Because the priestly class, they're the wealth, they're the fountain of all of the tradition and the direct commandments and processes that God has laid forth. So that's why it's sort of in this transition, and that's why you need the priestly class. But then again, it is in the history from the beginning. Is it what always happens? People they're tight, they stay together. You have this great renaissance and rebuilding, and then what happens again? There's this mixing again. And then what transpires is that rather than holding firm your tradition and your oneness, we allow yourselves to become secularized again, and then the process starts all over again.
Brian, thank you.
So Brian, let's hold on that comment, because I think there are actually sources that I think are going to give you a very different approach that I'll throw in there. Okay. Looking at it, I'm seeing some hands. The number of hands grow and the number of time we have left diminish. And so I see 4 hands up that haven't been called on. Do any of you have questions, like, to clarify what I said, or like, I at this point, I'd like to respond to questions specifically about what I said rather than bigger picture questions or comments. And if there's time later, we can go those, but I'd like to finish. And so if you have questions on what I said, so I can, continue along with me, that's great. If not, let's hold the bigger questions till after. So, Andrew and Heidi, I see your hand. Andrea Shapiro, Heidi, I see your hands are still up. I'm assuming that's because you have a specific question on something I said.
Heidi had her hand up first, and so we'll call on you.
Thank you. As I listened to you talk about this Parsha and the process that the Israelites went through, I felt that the way to internalize that, what crossed my mind was Kabbalah and the 4 worlds, or the 4 parts of the soul. And to me, and I want to know your knee-jerk reaction of that idea of merging the concept from the Kabbalah as a personal process as you read this Parsha, and the process of the people, and kind of, taking it in on an individual level.
We'll see. We'll close with that approach that may not directly answer everything, but it'll touch upon that. Andrea, last question for now.
We can hear you.
My question was, how well do you think this 4-step process worked? I mean, it's not but a few verses, and they're complaining about not having cucumbers, and they want to go back to Egypt. And it seems like And then they killed off a whole generation because they still had slave mentality.
Yeah,
But,
so
you know,
let me
they
use that as a transitional, as a segue. I think, you know, it's a work in progress. And I would say that it is a work in progress, not that it was. It is still a work in progress, but it is, you know, archetype concepts to learn from, I believe. So let me just segue in terms of did it work and did it not work. And I think sort of some of Brian's comments, which was it's an aside. If we were looking at my source sheet right now, what I'm about to say, I'm going to take it. We're not going to look at the source sheet. I'll just take it offhand for the sake of time. But it was at the end, in case we didn't get to it. And part of what I left it up is because I just like it. I'm not really sure if it fits in, but since it comes up, I'll share with you this idea. And, you know, generally we look at, there's a midrash that says very few of the actual slaves left Egypt. That they were not they didn't merit freedom, and they didn't survive the experience, possibly because of their assimilation or because their inability to leave their slave mentality, all sorts of processes. And that's generally, I think, how we understand that midrash for that 2,000 years, 3,000 years or so. At least that's what's written until in the last century or so. There is somebody whose book was called the Meshech Chachma, who wrote a very beautiful, I think, twisting of our understanding of that midrash. And he says, rather than looking at it as very few who survived and then looking at that as a model for the future that very few will survive, he says, actually, if you look at it, very few people, only 2 people who left Egypt went into Israel, which was the purpose of, or some understand is the purpose of freedom, Joshua and Caleb. So 2 out of 600,000 men survived. And so most of our history, we looked at that as everybody else didn't deserve it. They weren't traditional. They, you know, assimilated, and they, you know, were lost forever. So the Meshech Chachma says totally opposite that, and says, just as the initial liberation occurred, even though only 2 people would merit the actual salvation, yet everybody else was liberated, right? So too, the future redemption will still happen, even if it's only 2 people who deserve it. You know, that's how the Meshech Chachma looks at that historical midrash, which I think is a very beautiful, inclusive way to understand it, right? Rather than saying nobody else deserved it, you know, and yet he's saying it's even less than that. You think all those people who didn't survive? How about nobody survived except for 2 people, and yet the Exodus still happened, right? And so the ratio of people who are going to survive, even if they don't deserve it, is much, much higher than you think. The ratio of people who you think they're not going to continue the next generation because they're not Jewish enough or something, Meshech Chachma is saying it doesn't matter, right? God still wants them to survive. It's not just one type of people who are going to be the reason and cause and the beneficiaries of liberation. You know, so I think that's a very important pluralistic message and a way to understand our sources differently than what they are historically understood. And it's not like Meshech Chachma is looked at as a reformer. He's he's got a really long beard. So people kind of look at him as a pretty authentic voice in the Jewish tradition, and yet he's a radical reinterpretation of a midrash that I think is really beautiful. But anyway, let's look at the personal side. So we have 2. We have, I think, a more secular approach, but taking the ideas, and the religious approach. And I'll read to you them for the sake of time. One I didn't put in there because I didn't have a good excerpt. And the other one is in there. We'll look at it, and then hopefully there'll be some times for questions. So the first one is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the 7th rabbi of the Chabad dynasty, who died in the 90s, and a famous, important leader of modern Judaism. So he describes this as such, and I'll read to you an excerpt that I have down here. The 4 verbs in this passage allude to 4 ascending levels in our relationship with God, right? So the metaphor of the Torah is, it's really about a personal relationship with God. Everything that it's applying to the people is something you could take as an individual. So he said, and if it's the Rebbe saying it, you can assume there's an enormous amount of Kabbalah that is informing it. So this is the Kabbalistic approach for whoever was asking about that. I will free you refers to the shunning of evil, right? First, it's the first process. You have to first shun evil. By shunning evil, we become free agents, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you're good, but it means you're shunning evil. Unencumbered by evil's oppressive grip on us. So if you ever want personal salvation, first you got to find what the evil is. And then number 2, and even just finding it, naming it, is part of the experience of liberation. Number 2, I will rescue from slavery refers to doing good, right? So it's one thing to stay away from evil, another thing to then do good. Only by actively engaging in good deeds Can we be saved from backsliding into enslavement of evil, right? So you can say that I'm going to avoid evil, but unless you habituate doing good, you will likely backslide into your bad habits. And then 3, I will liberate you refers to studying Torah. So it's one thing to stay away from bad, another thing to do good without any intellectual experience process attached to it. Third is also to study Torah on top of that. Since the Torah is the means by which we access God's infinity, even while in this finite world, that's a Kabbalistic way of looking at what Torah is. A secular way, just to reinterpret this, is saying Torah is the intellectual, it goes far beyond just the doing of good. It becomes a deeper experience when we have the intellect attached to it, when we have understanding of the consciousness building experience of doing the deeds, of the intention of the Torah when programming us to train ourselves in this way. It takes it to the next level where the habituation towards good is more imprinted in who we are, which is a higher stage of liberation. And then last, he says, I'll take you as my people. And this refers to clinging to God himself. This is another Kabbalistic idea, is that once you've stayed away from bad and you do good and you attach an intellectual focus to it, then you have opened up the doors of possibility, not a guarantee, but the process has started for you to cling to God, which is the goal of Kabbalah and the goal of Hasidus. And that's hold on, what is it? The clinging to God himself, whose essence transcends all categorization, both the finite and the infinite. And that happens, you can actually cling and really be programmed already as being a holy, ascended, liberated person is the stage that the Rebbe looks at it through a Kabbalistic lens. And then, Mara, if we pop up the last source on the source sheet. Very similar, but written without the same religious Kabbalistic focus, as more of a personal growth focus. And we'll read that to you. Take it from a website that's on the source sheet. Written by a Jewish woman, by the way, but it didn't have to be. Although it does look like from the about the author, whatever, that the purpose she was looking at the Torah as a all the way. Not all the way down. I forgot I changed it. Go up a little bit to the English only. Keep going. There you go. So the Whole Being Institute website, I found this on, and she reads these 4 things as a approach to personal growth, right? So number 1 is I shall take you out from under the burdens. She says this refers to God stopping the hard labor, like we saw. The taskmaster stopped. While 10 plagues occurred over a period of time, the physical burden of claimed slavery came to an end before the Jews left Egypt. Right, there was a process that started, look before, as the beginning when God just said taskmasters aren't going to be able to force you. So she says the whole thing starts when you commit to stopping. Right, whatever it is, if you have a behavior, you have habits, you want to change, first commit to stopping. Right, that's like God taking you out from under the burdens. Number 2, I shall rescue you. That refers to God taking the Jews out of the very land of Egypt. She says first it's stop. Then it's you have to take yourselves out of temptation for whatever this is that's enslaving you, that is a burden on you, right? So she's saying number 1 is just say I want to stop, commit to stopping. Then number 2 is avoid it, avoid the temptation of whatever it is you want to grow away from, and actually come up with strategies to avoid it. And then number 3, next level of our mental schema. It's one thing to take a Jew out of Egypt, but quite another to take the Egypt out of the Jew, right? You can avoid things, doesn't mean you don't still have a desire inside, something habituated inside of you. And so the Jewish people had to be built from the ground up, essentially operating their operating system, changing their programming to unlearn their internal constructs. Can you keep scrolling down there? Right, and slave and understand what it means to be truly holy. So that's a whole nother level of, right, to say that I'm just avoiding, but you're still struggling with the thing constantly. It's another thing to then say, this is no longer my struggle. I've got new approaches. To the last, that's it. Sorry, I got Mark. You scroll up a little bit because all the chat stuff is covering the screen for me. There you go, a little bit higher. Yeah, thank you. Right, then you have the opportunity. Once you are really no longer burdened by whatever it is that's holding you back, then you have the opportunity to step into your higher purpose, right? And so that's the message I hope to leave with all of you. If you're feeling distraught or you're looking for spiritual liberation or personal development, that there is hope, that God has done it before, right? That's part of something I skipped over, but that lots of the commentators point out is that the Jews will know. They will see eventually that this is how it works. And just as I promised I would take them out of Egypt, and I did, and I promised I'll make them my people, and I brought them and I gave them a Torah, I will also take care of them in the future as well. And that should be a hope of comfort for those who need that hope of comfort. And it's also a promise that following these steps will benefit you as a human being, as to grow and to become closer to God is one way to look at it, or to be more of who you want to be as yourself is another way to look at it. Thank you for joining me, and I hope this was valuable. Shabbat Shalom. I have 2 minutes, so if we have some questions, I guess we'll start from somebody I haven't heard from yet, if anybody else has questions.
So you asked yourself this question and said you could do a whole share on it, a whole lesson on it. But I did get a message from Raphael about you mentioned that the 4-letter word for God is used, but it said in this parsha that it hasn't been used before. Can you sort of talk through interpretations of why that is?
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage anybody who's really interested to Google it, because there's a lot more than I can, do in a minute. And I'll just repeat what I mentioned earlier, which is it's not that, the most understand it not as a specifically that God hasn't used this spelling of his name in the way we're reading it. It's more of, what does that spelling of God's name represent? How does God manifest God's self in the world according to that name versus the name Elokeinu, Shaddai, Hashem Tzavako? There's so many different names of God, and they're not a description of God, because we can't describe God. They're really a description of the way in which God is manifested here in this world. And that spelling of God is an understood of God's attribute of mercy, right? And until the Jews until we understand that this world is a world that is built upon mercy, and that happened, that the first and biggest representation of that fact is the Exodus from Egypt, right? And so until that happened, that God can show God's mercy on an international, universal scale, it was just a promise that this might happen someday, and there wasn't a way to relate to God as a liberator just yet, right? And so that's how many understand that phrase, although I don't want to say that that's the only way, and there are people who would disagree with that, but so it's more thorough, you should Google it, but that's the easiest way for me to explain it real quickly.
Thank you so much. And again, for those who are new, you can expect a recording of this session along with the source sheet in your email later today. And there's a lot of people who have been asking for your email.
I'm putting in the chat right now.
Okay, so great. And otherwise, you're welcome to respond to the email, and we can do our best to forward those questions to Rabbi Daniel. And we are all wishing you a very restful weekend, a Shabbat Shalom, and we hope to learn with you again next week. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And if you don't get my email fast enough, you can find me on the GRAPS website also, gratz.org, .edu.
At
Yeah,
.edu.
so.
Yeah. Okay, thanks so much.
GRATS.edu. Find me, Daniel Levitt, if you're looking to reach out.
Great.
Shabbat Shalom. Nice to see everybody.